Great. My
Mark, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but it seems like you're in mute and folks can't hear you.
What about now?
Yep,
Can you hear
looks
me?
like you're all good now. Thank you.
Are you good? Okay, thank you. Thank you. My fellow presenters, have you ever had that dreadful feeling of being disengaged with your audience? You notice that they're avoiding eye contact, they're fidgeting with their smartphones, and they can't wait for those wonderful words and finally so that they can move on to the next presentation. Well, I certainly have. And I've done about 300 presentations in 30 countries over the past 12 to 15 years. And I think my current presentations aren't as bad as they used to be. So I've collected some practices which I'd like to share with you. Now, here's the deal. If you care enough about your audience to use some of these practices in your own way, I think you'll end up making a better presentation next time. So here's what I came up with. 4 suggestions which will help you on your way. The first one is accept that it's not about you. It's not your presentation, it's the audience's presentation. That's a major thing. The next one is that they'll be asking themselves 4 silent questions, which would be good for you to anticipate. The third point is think of learning objectives not only in terms of knowledge transfer, but also in terms of beliefs, abilities, and even feelings. And finally, be brave. Dare to choose your ideal audience, your minimum viable audience, because they're the best people to serve. If you try and please everybody, you'll end up with mediocrity. So let's start with the first point. Accept that it's not about you. Now, I know how it goes. You've been studying this topic that you're really passionate about, and you made a great presentation, and that's what you want to share. But the trouble is that might not be what the audience wants to hear. So you do need to approach it from their perspective, think about what kind of concerns they have and which material they need to address those concerns. And that often means that you've got to reduce your content considerably. You've got to kill your darlings, but they won't die in vain. You'll get a better presentation out of it. So that's the first point. Think about it's their presentation, not your presentation. Next up, the audience, and you will during my presentation, you'll be asking yourself 4 questions, I'm sure. The first one is, what on earth is he talking about? This is a non-trivial issue because I'm thinking from my frame of reference and you're listening from your frame of reference, and what's self-evident for me won't be self-evident to you. So I really have to take a step back and think about the basics. Pretty common rule is to tell people what you're going to say, tell it, and then say what you've just told them. It sounds trivial, but it really helps. So step back a bit and be clear about the self-evident stuff. Next, assuming that people have actually understood what you're talking about, the next question is, really? Is that plausible? Is there any evidence for that? Any research? So if there is, be clear about, what are your assertions based on? And they could be based on your own observations as well. You're the expert, so that's fine. Moving on to the third and more practical question is, so what? How is this relevant to me? How does this address my concerns? So think about what's in it for them. And then finally, assuming that you've got them engaged in the topic, in the presentation, what's next? Now what? So give people next steps to work on. So there you have 4 silent questions to anticipate. The third of my 4 points is the learning objectives. Now, you used to thinking about learning objectives in terms of knowledge transfer, but what I'd suggest is that you should also think about beliefs, abilities, what can people do after the presentation, and how will they feel? Now, these four learning objectives beg the question, what do the people know, believe, want to do, and feel before the presentation, and how is that going to change during the presentation? Now, this is hard, but even if you do half of this, I found this really helps me focus on what do I want to achieve in the presentation. So think in terms of knowledge, beliefs, abilities, and feelings. Last of my 4 points, be brave, dare to choose. When you make a presentation, it's a creative effort. And you say, here, I made this. It's for you. It's a pretty vulnerable statement, that. So you've got to be brave and think about who will this best serve. And that's what you call your minimum viable audience, your ideal audience. They're the people that you want to serve. Now, that implies, of course, that 99% of the world hasn't heard of you, isn't interested in your stuff, and that's okay. It's not for them. They need something else. Focus on the minimum viable audience. People like us do things like this. One of my favorite sayings from Seth Godin. So think about your minimum viable audience. Now, that was a presentation. If we reflect on the learning objectives, you should now know the 4 silent questions the audience will be asking themselves, the 4 kinds of learning objectives, knowledge, beliefs, abilities, and feelings. You should believe that it's not your presentation, it's theirs, and that focusing on the minimum viable audience will be more effective. I'm pretty confident that after this presentation, you'll be able to use some of this to to create, not deliver, that's another question, create a more effective presentation. And how do you feel? Hopefully inspired to improve your next presentation by applying some of this stuff, and possibly a bit apprehensive of having to choose your minimum viable audience. And finally, those magical words, I hope I've addressed the first 3 of those silent questions. Now the final one. What's next? Have a look at Seth Godin's work. He's got a great book for about $15. This is Marketing, his 20th book, I believe, but there's free stuff on this wonderful interview with him, half an hour interview on YouTube. Look at 3 Steps to Powerful Words. It's written for writing, but it's equally applicable for presentations, both in Dutch and in English. If you want to extend this beyond creating, but also delivering a presentation, Nancy Duarte's got a great book called Resonate, of which there's also a free online version. And finally, I've written a couple of articles on LinkedIn, one on those 4 silent questions, and the second one on those the 4 kinds of learning objectives. Now, this was my presentation. I hope it was yours as well. Thank you very much.